welcome everyone and good morning to all of you and welcome to Media City Bergen. This is our second day of Future Week. We had a blast opening up yesterday and we are going to continue on that vibe today. And to those of you who are spending your morning with us, you are particularly lucky because we have some really great guests today and we are starting off with James here. He is the global editor of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, where he oversees the non-for-profits international reporting projects. James also works as a freelancer and broadcaster and is a weekly columnist for the New European. And I'm sure some of you have seen his name connected to the Snowden case and the NSA leaks. Where he played a key part of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team that handled that case. Now he's here today with us to talk about stats versus story. Welcome to the stage, James.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's always kind of obligatory to say it's a pleasure to be here. It's an absolute pleasure to be here on so many levels in terms of, Bergen is a fantastic city. This is the first time I've been overseas in 18 months, and it's only my second time in front of a live audience, and the last one was yesterday. So it's absolutely wonderful, and thank you for the invitation. Do I have my very rudimentary slide behind me? So, compared to sort of 10 or 15 years ago, which was when I sort of entered journalism, data was a dirty word there, stats were a dirty word there, and if you used maths in the newsroom, you were to be sort of regarded with suspicion. We've moved a very, very long way along from that now, and that's an absolutely brilliant thing and essential for us actually doing our jobs right in the modern world. But I do think sometimes we have to jump back, because I worry about how much we tell stories for each other when we make these interactives, when we make great graphics, when we do this kind of stuff. Do we stop to think about what story people take from them? Because numbers don't mean the same things to different people. Numbers don't mean anything to some people. And so what I want to try and do in sort of the next half hour and then have some time for questions or for discussion is to try and sort of present the idea that we really have to think about context, about audiences, about sort of what we're trying to get across to who and why, perhaps more deeply than we do when we make even sort of the brilliant graphics and stories and investigations that we do. And so I'm going to sort of start in the 1970s, just because I like starting in the 1970s, and a car made by Ford called the Pinto. I've never really seen one of these, but I'm told they're a really tiny little runaround car that, pretty cheap, good value, sold in their millions, really successful car model, but for one thing. If it got sort of pranged at fairly low speed, but at the wrong angle, it would blow up. Less than ideal. And it turned out this could be fixed for a price at the time of $11 per car. Now, Ford knew about this vulnerability and knew about this fix. But they had worked out in very clear terms it made no sense to fix it. And this was the numbers and what the numbers told Ford. So to fix it was $11 per part, 12.5 million cars, $137 million. Please remember this is 1970s figures if some of these on this side look very low. Because it was fairly rare that the car got hit at this particular angle, Ford's modelling suggested that the fix would save 180 lives. And each life was worth, at that time, by official measures and what they'd be likely to have to pay out in compensation, $200,000. 180 fewer injuries, that was $67,000. 2,000 fewer totaled vehicles. And so the benefits of doing this work were 49.5 million. Now, if you're a Ford executive, these numbers tell you a very clear story. They tell you not to do it. If you are the relatives of someone who was killed by a Ford Pinto with this vulnerability, imagine what looking at that sheet would do to you. And imagine, and this is perhaps what was missing from the numbers that Ford's executives calculated, imagine what happens when you have to release this document when you're being sued. And it ran in quite a lot of newspapers, and most people did not see the cost-benefit analysis in the way that Ford did. Now, the difficult thing here is obviously it's very easy for us to look at that and go, how utterly appalling that is by Ford. But in a different way, these calculations get made all the time. You know, should an extra safety standard go into something? How much should the government spend on road lighting? How much should... You know, Ford aren't necessarily totally wrong to make the calculation, but the same spreadsheet, the same two columns, tells two completely different stories to different audiences. The other sort of 1970s era, I am moving us to Corona pretty soon, I'm afraid, sorry. So, you know, enjoy the retro stuff while it lasts. The other 1970s era, I think, is a good lesson for something that we still do all the time, which is when the argument we want to make is political or moral or in some other way not measurable, but we're not confident in it, and so we try to put it in moral terms. And the best example from this, these are stolen from a Harvard philosopher, by the way, Michael Sandel, just, you know, credit my sources, are St Anne's College in Oxford in the 1970s was still an all-girls college. Oxford colleges were still, some of them were still single-sex until about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And through the 1970s, formally, they could have no male overnight guests for the entire time they lived in college accommodation. And by sort of 1978, 1979, this was really starting to look dated. And a lot of younger sort of faculty members at the college were pushing to, you know, let the women do what they want, you know, let the female students do what they want and have overnight guests. Now, a lot of the older traditionalist faculty members wanted to sort of push back on this and oppose it, but knew that doing it based on sort of outdated sort of traditionalist social mores would look bad in that particular sort of place and political climate. And so they started making arguments based on the cost to the college. One of them was the beds would have to be replaced more often, there'd be more laundry costs, there'd be more sort of issues like this. And so the college came up with what must have seemed to it like a sort of grudging compromise, which was each girl could have overnight guests up to 3 times per week, but he had to pay 50p per night. Now, anyone who's familiar with British newspapers might be able to guess what happened next, which was headline, St Anne's Girls 50 pence per night. Probably wasn't what the traditionalists were aiming for when they tried to put a moral argument in financial terms. So, sorry, I keep my notes on this. I'm not just really millennial and need it as a comfort blanket. So, you know, we've got the issues of when we move numbers out of context and forget what they mean to different people. We've got the issues of where we put numbers where they shouldn't be in arguments, both of which I think newsrooms do. There's also the issue when the fact that any number bigger than about 1,000 is capable of breaking our brains. And so a quite fun one from the last week or so is when the BBC suggested that we have been using 129 billion face masks every day. Now, if that sounds a bit off to you, I suggest you think about how many people there are in the world. And that's about 7 billion. And so, according to this BBC figure, every single man, woman and child across the planet has once an hour, 17 hours a day, used a brand new face mask. Now, that might not be a particularly damaging stat, but it's the kind of thing that people will just repeat and repeat and repeat if it comes from a credible source. And a lot of our readers will do exactly the same, especially because they assume we've checked it. There's an interesting sort of extra wrinkle to that. It turned out what the BBC had done is accidentally misread per day as per month. And so it's 129 billion per month, and that was cited to some academic research. But I am not going through 17 masks per month, if I'm honest. I have washable ones, and during lockdown, I spent months and months at home, and I wasn't wearing a mask when I was at home on my own to protect my cats. I'm sorry. And so what they'd done was take a study in the Lombardy region at sort of the peak of the pandemic there, and extrapolate that population from that region of Italy across the planet, and probably got a figure that was just as meaningless, but much more plausible than the other one. But we're starting to get to sort of the spiky end of what I want to talk about. And it's when we're talking about things that are actually genuinely complex, and you've got to get your head around them as a newsroom. And how do we then actually get them to a general audience? And here's the one I've seen really good reporters and good journalists screw up time and time again. And it's this. It's vaccination and vaccine effectiveness. And in all sorts of places, I see lots of conversation about there's more vaccinated people in hospitals than unvaccinated people. You know, more vaccinated people are dying of corona than not. It doesn't work. And given the huge vaccine hesitancy problems we're having in countries across the world, anything that can suggest it doesn't even work against coronavirus, you know, even leaving aside that it's got 5G and it's made by Bill Gates to stop you reproducing, all of that stuff, is really quite damaging. And so, moving us away from the real stats, it's a lot easier to look at it in an imaginary world where this is just how it is. We're not talking about any real vaccine here. We've got a country of 1 million people. And over the course of a year, if we didn't do anything, half of them would get coronavirus. We've got a great vaccine. It's 90% effective. So if you have that, you go down to 5%. Everyone happy so far? 90% of people took the vaccine. So this has been dream vaccine. 90% effective vaccine is way better than a lot of the ones in the world. 90% uptake, brilliant. What are the cases going to look like? So, turns out you've got roughly the same number of cases among vaccinated people and unvaccinated people. And so if you only look at the infected people, you're going to go, well, there's 95,000 people have caught the virus this year. 45,000 of them are uninfected. You know, did we do all of that work just to get that tiny improvement? And it's because people forget this number and this number. This number. Didn't go, no, it got over the line, that stopped it. There's 900,000 people contributing to that bit. and 100,000 people contributing to that bit. So the vaccine actually works really well. It's just there's a huge group of people who had the vaccine and a really quite small group of people who didn't. That's a hard story to tell. And it's the kind of story that you have to tell clearly and several times for people to get through. And I don't think we do a good job of telling these stories because we tend to tell them once and move on. Or we tend to actually just look at the bottom number because that's a bit of a dramatic story if you don't know about the top one. And this is where my concern comes in for audience, because there's a genuinely difficult thing to do here. If you're a specialist health journalist or a specialist data or statistical journalist, or especially a visualization journalist, a lot of the incentives for us are to talk to each other. You know, doing a really, really cool multi-plot or a dynamic graphic or a sophisticated sort of analysis of the relative performance of different vaccines is much more likely to win you plaudits and win you awards and win you respect in the group. What I worry about is that the best use of your talents in terms of simplicity? Because, and I'm going to have to check the stats, this is the UK public. The Norwegian public may be far more sophisticated, but only 1 in 5 Brits said that they could calculate either a fraction or a percentage. Not both, one or the other. And so that means 4 in 5 Brits couldn't do either. And pretty much every news story you ever read in a broadsheet will have at least 3 or 4 percentages throughout it. You know, are we assuming too much knowledge on behalf of people reading it? It goes even lower, by the way, for averages. It's fewer than 15% say they could explain what either a mean, median, or mode is. And knowing the difference between a median and a mean is pretty important. Certainly if you're talking about incomes, if you're talking about life expectancy, if you're talking about all sorts of things. And so what I worry about, and what I talk about when I'm talking about stats versus story, is this sense of journalism has got a lot better at this. I think journalism has embraced the idea that visuals help us tell stories, that numbers help us understand the world. But firstly, I don't want us to forget, if we're talking to a general audience, we can't run so fast that we leave them behind. I think we have to also sometimes decide when we're talking to a general audience and when we're talking to a specialist one. There's nothing wrong with talking to a specialist audience sometimes. They're a constituency too. We want to keep them engaged. We also have to be careful if we're changing our message for the wide audience. We don't alienate the specialists who tend to hate it when you simplify. But we also need to remember the stuff from the earlier ones of, will someone else look at a number and see it in the same way as I am? Do I risk doing something like presenting the flawed balance sheet and giving someone else a totally different impression than the one I meant to? And so I think, you know, I always tend to, you know, I'm from Yorkshire, I tend to be the voice of, are we messing up? Are we doing this wrong? Is this bad? I think we've had great progress in all of these areas. And so that's why I think this is a good time to take stock. And so that's why I sort of asked us and framed this as stats versus story. And I think I'll wrap there and have a chat with Oda.
Fantastic, James. Thank you so much. We are going to open up for questions from the audience, and Mia or someone will be running around with a microphone. But I can start it off by just asking, you talk about knowledge of our audience. How can we, do you think we are good enough in the newsrooms to really pay attention to what kind of audience we are talking to at any given time?
No, and I think we tend to try and flatter ourselves a little bit with the audience sometimes. I can remember a colleague of mine somewhere I used to work, fantastic journalist, really nice guy, but he tended to be, he would do quite dense sort of financial or technical pieces, and one of them had got 80,000 on the site, and fantastic numbers for that kind of piece. I was congratulating him. And he sort of went, oh, I don't care. He went, the paper sells 190,000. It ran on page 11 of the paper, so 190,000 people read it there. And you know where it's like, that's not how newspapers work. It was a down pager on page 11. You'll be lucky if 4,000 people read par one. And so there's firstly, we flatter ourselves on the size of it. But I think we also imagine everyone sort of loftily reading over the breakfast table and digesting every word, you know, maybe calling to their partner to share some, you know, people kind of half skim, and if something jumps out at them, take it. And so, you know, I think we've got better at worrying about context when it comes to headlines and social. But I don't know if we always think about context and comprehension in the rest of our pieces. And it's a difficult thing to test, you know. Wouldn't it be nice if you could almost, you know, when you're about to file a draft, put it in front of a random test reader and quiz them or something, you know, it'd be the dream. But I think publications do a lot of audience research for sales and for ads, and, you know, sometimes for what content will appeal. It would be nice if we did some research for comprehension, especially given all the worries we have about misinformation and disinformation, etc.
And I also think that's a really good point there. And I also think that goes to our in-house sort of way that we organize our newsrooms, because that would also mean that not only the data journalists or the journalist that works with stats need to think about this, but maybe also all journalists in the newsroom needs to have a sort of a knowledge of how stats and visuals are received.
Definitely. Yeah. And actually, I think this is where good progress is happening. You know, that's presented as a challenge. I actually do think, you know, newsrooms, it did used to be, there might be one person sitting in a dusty corner next to the library, which still existed then, you know, sort of half covered in cobwebs themselves. It has come closer to the middle of the newsroom. People want these kinds of stories. People want them told well. But actually, in some ways, it's where informed generalists, you know, desk editors and even reporters actually should be serving as a challenge on the proper sort of data editors and statistics editors to kind of go, you know about that bit, but are you sure this is clear enough to an actual general reader? And obviously a Financial Times reader is going to be different from a general BBC reader or a Sun reader. Sorry for using UK examples. I'm just not familiar enough with Norwegian papers, alas.
Yeah. Are there any questions here?
I'm just going to run and get water. I'm not escaping the questions, I promise.
Yeah, there's one there. Just wait until you have a microphone there.
Thanks, James. Very interesting talk. I really appreciate it. So my background is that I was a visualization researcher for quite many years, and I see similar problems that we have in research that we also have in journalism. That, you know, a lot of research we are doing is kind of just for the visualization community, and we take pride in it, but it never really sees the light of public, and no one really can understand it. One thing that I noticed, one of the developments that we have seen in the last years is more adaptive visualizations. So as soon as you have the computer medium, you can start interact with the visualizations. And is this something that trickled down to journalism as well, that, you know, you have some adaptive visualizations that you can interact with, that you can maybe adjust the level of complexity there? Is this something you have seen?
I don't know if I've seen ones on complexity too often. I've seen things that try and work by letting people do them. There's some quite good budget calculators that let people move things around, which I think work quite well at helping people start to get a grasp on what's expensive and what sounds expensive and isn't, and so on. But actually, I really like the idea of trying to bring that into newsrooms. I think that's exactly the kind of fix that's needed. And it may be that some places are already experimenting with it, because it would be good to have a default sort of, actually like a lot of video games do. They have a mode for when you're learning, and then suddenly you can toggle it, and there's 16 extra buttons and slides and filters. I think that's probably exactly what's needed, because, as someone with a stats background, I couldn't, tons of my reporting the last year, the FT's amazing corona charts have been immensely useful. But if I was coming as a general audience reader, like not an FT general audience reader, just a general one, I would be so daunted by it, I don't think I would touch it. And that's the gold standard best stuff. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of promise in that.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Yes?
Thank you. I really like this idea of stories instead of stats, because that's what it's about. But about math and statistics and journalism, I mean, journalists tend to think that they're bad at mathematics or statistics, and it's sort of a common understanding that we can do nothing about it. But I think the pandemic has been a sort of a crash course in statistics for journalists. Have you seen any sort of change for the better?
I think it was improving before the pandemic. I think it used to be totally okay to kind of almost go, I'm a reporter, I don't do maths. And I think it's fair to say a lot of people didn't go into journalism because they wanted to do maths through their adult life. But unfortunately, that tends to go with it. And so I think it's becoming less acceptable to say, I won't touch it at all, I don't need it, I won't get there. But yes, I think the pandemic has sort of helped kind of show why you need it to be able to talk about it. And because so many people have moved on to the health beat, which you can't do without maths, maybe when people move back to their general beats, they'll have those skills, they'll have that. It's the smallest of silver linings from a very, very big cloud. But I would have thought there would be advantages. I mean, I think one thing it really shows is the stakes of getting it wrong. Because I think countries, you can see the gaps in countries, and there's huge cultural reasons behind misinformation. There's baseline trust, there's all sorts. But also, good reporting can help. And the UK is in culture wars on about 16 different fronts and falling apart in 14 different ways. And I'm hoping there's enough petrol for a plane to fly back. I don't think planes use petrol. I'm not an aviation expert. But we've actually managed to have a very good vaccine uptake. That's sort of actually one area where the media is held together and reported quite accurately and reported quite well. And it shows even in a country as sort of filled with ructions as ours, actually you can, with decent information, push some things past. I'm not giving the media all of the credit, but I think a little bit is due.
I have room for one last question, quickly, if anyone has something. Yeah?
If I might go again.
Yes, please do. There are some people following us on the stream as well, so.
So this might be a bit of a loaded question. One thing that so some projects that I experienced were in collaboration with journalism in Czech Republic, and we tried to show the impact of global warming. And one problem that we see is that humans in general have problems to understand scales and timelines. Do you have any tips on how to approach this? How to make this more, just get the grasp of it?
I mean, we are just not designed to understand anything between a million, a billion, and a trillion. I always like when people do, the million seconds, a billion seconds is 31 years, etc. But it's really anything that can move things onto a sort of human comprehensible scale. And so the very old kind of hokey cliche one is reducing the world to 100 people in a village. But things become cliches for a reason. it's actually, 100 people in a village is just doing percentages. But it's, there's ways to modernize that and do it for all sorts of issues on social inequality or on distribution of people or that kind of thing. I think the big challenge is finding ways to turn climate into something human, because we don't, what is the easy way to say what 3 degrees means for the, amount of crops that will grow in 20 years, which is the real question we care about. We don't intrinsically care about keeping it to 1 degree or 2 degree or 3 degrees because we care about the Celsius. We care about the consequences of it. And so you not only have the scale problems you're talking about, you have that humans are really bad at second order effects. And we always try, and it's why we sort of go, crime you deal with by locking people up. You don't think, hey, there's this cleverer route of, try and stop people committing crime in the first place. And so, social programs, etc. And so it is a problem almost designed to confound humans. It's a very, very hard one. And so I wish I had an obvious, here's how to do 2 degrees, or here's how to. But anything that gets things onto human scales is good. Anything that can help people see how, even if it's not a direct route, X will help stop Y or X will help cause Y is good. And I think that's the two things that tend to fall apart in people understanding something.
Thanks. Beautiful words of wisdom.
Thank you.
And with those beautiful words of wisdom, we're going to wrap up here. I have a small gift for you, James. Something that all media people need these days, alcohol.
Oh, thank you very much.
It is beer. It's made from a recipe made from AI.
Oh, wow.
Especially targeted to the people of Bergen and media people. As you are part of our extended family now, I thought that this could happen.
So, fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James.
Thank you, everyone.
To all of you, make sure to check out the Media Future Week program, where you go to mediacitybergen.no online and you will find the full program. There will be tons of activities here today, and I would really encourage you to join in. Thank you all for coming.